the master of the abandoned cottage. Katya had tried to move on from Mikhail. He had wandered into her life one summer, like a storm sweeping across the sea, intense, unpredictable, and gone just as quickly. They'd spent a few perfect weeks in an old cottage by the coast, drinking wine on the porch and promising things neither of them could keep. Then, one day, he disappeared, leaving her with no explanation, just a hollow ache in her chest. She had told herself to forget him, but the cottage lingered in her mind like a wound that refused to heal. When the boys she met that autumn asked if she knew of an abandoned place for one of their reckless parties, the answer came to her immediately. It was as if the house had been waiting for her to remember it. The owner left a long time ago, she told them, the words tasting strange on her tongue. She didn't mention Mikhail, or how she had sometimes dreamed of him standing in the cottage window, his dark eyes watching the waves crash below. She didn't say that the house had once been the site of strange rituals, a spiritualist salon where people gathered to summon spirits and unlock the doors to other worlds. And she didn't tell them about the last time she saw Mikhail walking into that house as if called by something waiting inside. The boys whooped with excitement when they arrived at dusk, lugging speakers, alcohol, and bags of junk food through the sagging front door. The cottage was even more eerie than Katya remembered, its wooden walls warped by salt and time, strange symbols faintly carved into the archways. The scent of something stale and bitter hung in the air, like the ghost of old incense. As the boys cranked up the music and started drinking, Katya wandered through the dim hallways, drawn deeper into the house. Memories came rushing back, Mikhail's laugh echoing through the empty rooms, the warmth of his hand in hers as they explored the abandoned space. She had been so sure they would stay together forever, back then. Her steps led her to a familiar room with a cracked mirror on the wall. She hesitated, her heart heavy with the weight of what-ifs and unfinished goodbyes. Wiping the dust from the mirror, she froze. In the reflection, Mikhail stood behind her. He hadn't aged a day. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his smile was the same, crooked and boyish. But his eyes, there was something wrong with them. They gleamed too brightly, like polished black glass, and when he met her gaze through the mirror, she felt a cold, unseen hand grip her heart. "Mikhail?" she whispered, spinning around. He was there, as real as the last time she saw him, but there was an unnatural stillness about him, as if he were more shadow than man. His pale skin looked like it belonged to someone who had been buried for years. "I waited for you," he said softly, his voice familiar but slightly off, like a song played on a detuned piano. Katya's breath caught in her throat. "Where have you been? What happened to you?" Mikhail's smile faded. "The house, it keeps what it takes." Before Katya could respond, the music in the other room distorted, warping into a low, eerie hum, like an old radio struggling to find a station. The boys' laughter turned to panicked shouts. Then, one by one, the voices cut off. Katya ran back to the living room. At first glance, it seemed empty, just overturned furniture and scattered belongings. But then the walls shifted, and she saw them. The boys hadn't simply vanished. Their bodies were inside the walls, twisted and contorted, their faces pressed into the wood like grotesque reliefs. Their mouths opened and closed silently, as if they were screaming in a place no one could hear. Some of their limbs still twitched, stuck in half-finished movements, while their eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, begging for release. Katya staggered back in horror, bile rising in her throat. "They were taken," Mikhail said quietly from behind her, "just like I was." She turned to him, fear and disbelief warring in her mind. "But you're here. You escaped." Mikhail shook his head slowly, a hint of sadness in his expression. "I didn't escape, Katya. I became part of it." The realization hit her like a wave of freezing water. Mikhail wasn't alive. He was a puppet of the house, a fragment of the man he used to be, held together by whatever dark force ruled the cottage. And now it wanted her too. "You need to leave," Mikhail whispered urgently. "If you stay, the house will take you. It's hungry and it won't stop until it has everything." The walls groaned and the twisted faces of the boys seemed to shift toward her, mouths stretching wider as if welcoming her into their eternal nightmare. "Go, Katya," Mikhail pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please." Katya hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to stay, to pull him free, to undo whatever curse had bound him to this place. But she knew it was too late. He was no longer the Mikhail she had loved. He was just another piece of the house's collection. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mikhail's smile was sad, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I know." She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the darkened hallways. The shadows twisted around her, whispering in languages she didn't understand, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. The door loomed ahead, just slightly ajar. She threw it open and stumbled out into the night. The wind howled around her as she gasped for air, her lungs burning. Behind her, the cottage stood silent, its windows black and empty once more. But just as she reached the bottom of the cliffside path, she looked back. In the highest window of the cottage, Mikhail stood watching her. His hand rested against the glass, and though his face was still, his eyes held something she couldn't bear to understand. Something eternal. The wind carried his voice, barely audible. "Come back, Katya. You know you'll have to." And deep in her heart, she knew he was right.